from Amsterdam. Good to see you, Andre. Good to see you, Elina. We are exactly on time here, but we're still waiting for quite a lot of people to join this hopefully fantastic session. So over 200 signups, eh? Not bad.
Promising indeed. It seems there's a lot of interest for service mapping, which makes me happy. I think it's one of the modules which is very close to my heart. So I'm looking forward, to have this conversation.
Exactly. Super nice. Okay, but let's get this party started here a little bit. I'm gonna go ahead straight up and share my screen here, and yeah, then we're gonna have a fun hour here together. So indeed, good morning, everyone. Then great to see such interest in this particular topic of service mapping. As I said, we have 1 hour here together, so it's a full packed schedule here today. We have a lot of data that we want to show, so we're gonna get straight into it actually, more or less. But for those of you who haven't joined any of our masterclasses or sessions before, my name is Alexander, and I'm going to introduce myself more closely soon. But more importantly, we work for Einar and Partners, and just to contextualize a little bit who we are a specialized firm that work with the ITOM strategy and AI ops actually, where ServiceNow is our primary platform. And I'd like to claim that we've now gotten some experience in this area. So with data models, service operations, CMDB, and of course service mapping is very close to our heart. And in matter of fact, we've done now over 100 transformations in ITOM. So simplifying complexity is what we do every day here at Einar and Partners. Now, to box today in a little bit, we're going to cover a couple of topics, all right? So first of all, we're going to have a look at the wider trends for service mapping. We've done some fantastic research, which Elina has been leading, and she will tell a little bit more on that. We're also going to look at best practices. So we're not just measuring data around here, but we're actually also looking at how do we projects, how do we shorten time to value, how do we even explain value, for example, to organizations when it comes to service mapping. And we're going to look at some other benchmarks and intelligence as well. Some of the things that we promised is have a look at internal efforts, time to value, durations to map services, and other things. And there is also a Q&A in the end. So for those of you who have joined, you should actually be able to go to the Q&A box and you can write us questions. If it's like a short, simple, easy question, we might answer it on the spot. If it's a little bit more complicated, we might save it to the end. And if it's really complicated, we might get back to you personally after the webinar. Also for your information, the session today is being recorded as per usual. So you can later on find this on our YouTube channel. So in case you want to go back to something, then just find our video in a couple of days and then you can pause and really geek out on the data in your own time. But with that being said then, as I said, my name is Alexander Ljungström and I'm the managing director at Einar and Partners. This is also, just like with you, Andre, a topic that I am super passionate about. I started my career 12 years back when it comes to the ServiceNow space. And guess what? Back then, I used to work at ServiceNow with the service mapping product. So I've been like deep down in its code base. So that's where it all started. But of course, a lot have happened in 12 years in this product. And that's a little bit why we're here today. But I'm not by myself. I have my lovely team with me. So Andre, I know you're also a service mapping geek, but who are you? Not
Indeed.
only that.
Indeed. My name is Andres, item advisor. And I've had the pleasure to implement service mapping for the past, I think, 8 years at a lot of numerous customers. And I wish I could say I've seen them all, but honestly, I see new challenges day by day. So yeah, I think service mapping is a fascinating module. I've had a lot of fun implementing it, and I think I have a lot of insights for the group who has joined us today.
Yes, super nice. Glad to have you here, Andre. And then
thanks for having me.
Yeah, we have you, Elina. So Elina, who are you?
Thank you so much. So my name is Elena. I work as a research analyst and Einar of partners, meaning that together with the research unit team, we work on different benchmarking projects. And currently, over the 12 months, we have been working on service mapping and have some very interesting data and findings to share here with you.
Yes, glad to have you on board, Lina. Good. So then you know a little bit more around us. Now, I want to set the scene a little bit here. First of all, I want to set the scene a little bit around service mapping as a topic. But then also you, Elina, are going to tell a little bit more around the actual research we've done before we jump in to all of the data. So I think a lot of people who have joined here today, they already know about service mapping. In case you don't, if this is literally like the first time you hear the word service mapping, then I'm sorry, today we're not going to cover the basic sort of what does the product do. There's excellent resources for that, both at Einar and Partners YouTube channel, ServiceNow documentation, etc. But what I want to speak more about today together with my colleagues is actually how is the sort of industry moving with service mapping. But when we have a look at what service mapping used to be, again, when I started working, and probably you, Andre, like 8-10 years ago, then it was really that sort of niche tool for infrastructure geeks, let's say. Obviously, back then, it was mostly focused on the on-premise systems, so typical legacy systems. Also, today we see a lot around CSDM, and you tend in the platform to have this bigger picture of the data model. Service mapping back in the days, it wasn't really that correlated to a broader data model, such as the CSDM framework. And in matter of fact, I like to argue when service mapping started, the IT landscapes in general, they were less complex than what they are today. So on the flip side, if we look at where are we today then with service mapping, well, it's pretty much universal that service mapping and in matter of fact, mapping services at scale is becoming critical for most companies. Also, it's not just on-premise systems anymore. We see that it really encapsulates both cloud, still on-premise, microservices, and the service mapping product is getting way more holistic as well. Also there, it has way stronger correlation to, let's say, the business context. So we can actually see what is impacted, what are the risks, for example, when a service goes down. It's a lot these days around regulations, especially here in the European Union with things like DORA, NIST, etc. But perhaps more importantly, I think that when we today look at how enterprises are operating, a lot of architectures, they almost change on the fly. And there is cloud sprawl, we have auto-scaling, and we still have that large legacy. So today, service mapping can actually cover all of these areas. And I think this just speaks on the development of the product. And this is a little bit why we did the research as well, because we see that it's getting such a critical tool that is not just enough to have the infrastructure-oriented CMDB anymore, but we actually need to take the next steps with as much automation as possible. So the fundamental question, though, remains in a lot of people's minds, which is the basic question of, is it worth it? And I think that's a little bit what we want to shed light upon today. So, Elina, you've sat down with a research unit for over 12 months, actually, and you've done a tremendous work, I think. So why don't you tell a little bit more what we've actually done the past year when it comes to service mapping?
Thank you so much, Alex. So basically, over the 12 months, we have conducted a deep dive research on service mapping using a two-level principal component analysis, meaning that we had to go through 75 global enterprises. We have been using 35 data measures and also conducted around 15 interviews. Three main points of our benchmarking were service mapping, scoping, and roadmaps, meaning that we were interested on seeing how organizations are clear on what they want to map and why is the reason behind that. Service mapping time to value, meaning that we were also interested to see more about the implementation time of the service mapping projects. And the third point, service mapping efforts and resourcing, meaning that we were also interested on knowing what the level of the effort and also of the people that were involved in service mapping projects.
Fantastic. Super interesting. And could you then tell a little bit more around, because people might wonder, how are we actually like measuring this and what are the methodologies we're using and so forth? Could you spend a minute or two to explain our system here a little bit?
Sure, of course. So basically how we have done service mapping benchmarking project and also how we do other benchmarking projects, we have our own item intelligence platform that we use to design, collect, process the data. So on the left, you can see how we engage with clients using survey ops and also monitoring them, meaning that we use standardized surveys and also tap into expert networks and professional media channels such as LinkedIn or ServiceNow communities. Therefore, all the data that we collect or benchmark, it's indexed, it's structured, and analyzed using different tools such as Excel or Python. However, we also, this kind of platform enables us to do descriptive data, but other than that, we use exploratory data as well, and also build benchmarking KPIs that are relevant and also are aligned with industry segments. Therefore, this kind of platform that we use leaves us the opportunity to see what leaders are doing differently in different benchmarking projects, and also share the insight with professional and relevant stakeholders.
Super interesting. Yeah. So we actually today have quite a big network of enterprises that we're continuously collaborating with. And the idea is indeed that we want to bring real intelligence to how we can truly optimize projects, what are the success factors and so forth. And that's what we want to speak about today. And Elina, could you tell a little bit more on what sort of enterprises is it? How wide is this network, especially for service mapping?
Perfect. Thank you so much. So for the service mapping benchmarking project, we had a global collaboration with different enterprises for 12 months, meaning that we have collaborated with experts across every continent from different industries such as financial services to healthcare, retail, government, energy, and beyond that. Importantly, it's very important to highlight that we have excluded our own clients from the benchmarking project in order to remove bias and also to ensure credibility on what we have been benchmarking. The outcome of this benchmark is truly global because it helps organizations position themselves not only in terms of internal performance, but also how they are related to their peers across different geographies and sectors when service mapping is implemented. So if you can see at this map, seeing this map, you can also see how service mapping journey differs to different companies and industries, and also how this collaboration with different companies can help us in the future to shape the maturity of the item.
Super nice, super nice. So thank you so much, Elina, that you set the scene here a little bit. So with that being said, now we're gonna actually look at some of this data. And I want to mention that the data here we're gonna speak about is the first time ever, I think, that data like this is actually being released to the public. Now, we won't be able to geek out in depth on all the data today. I mean, we could spend 8 hours just speaking about all the data. If you're interested later on in really understanding the nits and grits of this data and how you can optimize your own projects and so forth, obviously just reach out. But today we're gonna touch upon the most important data points, let's say. So let's then jump into the industry trends. And I think the first thing that we're interested in is actually looking at where is the industry heading with service mapping in general, right? And in order to contextualize that, Some of you might know that actually when we are working with service mapping, not all applications are the same. Not all services are the same. So the first thing we did was actually define complexity levels of applications and services. And the way that we've done that is we've categorized it in simple, medium, or high level of complexity. So a simple one is, for example, simple three-tiered application, self-hosted, very standard off-the-shelf applications, and a highly complex application that would be something homegrown, extremely complex architectures, highly secured environments, large number of dependencies and technologies. So this is the first thing that we need to take in mind when we speak about the data and sort of where the industry is heading. The second part is actually, well, when we look at service mapping, there is different ways that you can do service mapping. I'm not going to cover these in details today, but just to skim through them a little bit, we have pattern-based or top-down mapping. We have traffic and machine learning-based mapping, so looking at network traffic. We have the tag-based mapping, and we actually have manual mapping as well. So again, this is something that we need to look at and take into consideration when we're looking at how people are working with the service mapping product. So it is the complexity in combination with what type of service mapping people are doing. And here, the first thing here, and Andre, feel free here as well to jump in as I go, but I think the first question is, what are people really using to automate more? Well, here we can see the complexity levels, and still actually leading is the top-down and pattern-based one. Tag-based is definitely coming up there. But what we're also seeing is that hybrid of actually using, a combination of manual mapping together with the automatic service mapping, that is also being still very, very popular. What is less popular in the overall scheme of things is the traffic and ML-based options. So I think here the key takeaway is that tag-based is gaining ground really fast, but a hybrid approach between manual mappings and automatic, it's also continuing to be rather popular actually. And I think here, Andre, on the next slide, we even dive in a little bit deeper into this, right? So
Yeah,
what could you
indeed.
say about this?
Indeed. Maybe you can take a step back.
Yeah.
I also have an interesting insight here. First of all, I love the fact that organizations are pushing towards this tag-based method because I think most of them realized, hey, we can actually leverage the relationships that we have in the CMDB. So it's like two for one. You run discovery or you run integrations, you have the relationships, and then you can also leverage tags to create these service maps, which are very powerful. And I think the second insight here is also the fact that when it comes to traffic and ML-based service mapping, I think a lot of organizations realized the manual maintenance and the manual effort required to actually leverage this solution on its own. And I think that's one of the main reasons why I've seen a lot of organizations in the past using traffic-based in conjunction with something else, also automatic. So yeah.
So it's not just standalone. And here, another thing that we looked at, right, Andre, was that okay, one thing is like, are we using pattern-based, traffic-based, etc. But then actually contextualizing that in the type of technologies and configurations as well. So could you speak on behalf of this a little bit?
Sure, 100%. So in this case, when it comes to technologies, of course, cloud-based services and on-prem services continue to dominate, as kind of expected, I would say. And one another additional insight is that if we take a look at the tag-based service mapping, a lot of organizations also use this for on-prem systems. Again, I think this is in connection to having the relationships already in the CMDB and leveraging that to create these types of maps. And then another interesting insight just by looking at the chart is, as you can see, if we take a look at the Kubernetes and the Docker environments, you can see that the percentages are quite low. And I think that makes sense because I've seen a lot of organizations not seeing the value of investing the licenses to actually have this type of data into the CMDB to begin with. Additionally, not even creating service mapping based on these.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that is absolutely true. And of course, there are some people who really are using this for, their containerized environments and so forth. But I think it all depends on how your sort of DevOps structure is already set up. But I think here microservices will more and more gain ground, that's for sure. But what is interesting indeed for me as well is that these sort of cloud-based services is continuing sort of to gain strength every year, basically. So that's very interesting as well. Now, if we look here at the next slide, the actual complexity then that people are mapping. So, and I think that supports the argument here a little bit, Andre, that what we actually measured here was looking at, okay, in these different type of applications, what is the complexity level that people are trying to map? We don't really care so much about the mapping methodology here, but just like what type of complexity. So if you have a look at this, what can be sort of inferred from this, Andre?
Yeah, for sure. So as you can see, like the percentages are very high when it comes to medium complexity systems. And I think a lot of organizations just want to leverage, the core of the services that they have inside their organizations mostly. And yeah, I think service mapping is a great tool for 4 layers of depth, maybe 5 layers of depth. And I think when it comes to medium-sized complexity, I think the time to value can be shortened, and I think the actual effort to create such maps is in their value. Helps them a lot, basically.
Yeah, and we're gonna look at that more later, actually, on the time to value. And just as a side note here, because this doesn't just speak about service mapping in a way, but we're actually are looking at the general trends of complexity of different applications too. And what I find a little bit, well, maybe not funny, but interesting at least, is that when it comes to those sort of containerized services, almost none of them are simple. And the irony of, wanting to have, basically microservices increases complexity is what I'm trying to say here. So
true. And I think it also goes hand in hand with what you said at the beginning, that we've seen a tendency to, for services to go from a monolithical approach to a more microservices approach.
Yeah.
And we can definitely see this reflecting in the research that we've done.
Exactly. And someone wrote a interesting comment here now in the Q&A in that, and I think that's absolutely true, that more people are probably using tag-based approach because there is a shift as well to move still things to the cloud, right? So that continues to affect it. So that was a little bit around basically, like how are we seeing the trends and what are people doing and what are they using and so forth. Again, we're just skimming through the sheer amount of data we're having here. But what I think a lot of people have joined the call for today is knowing a little bit more around, well, what is expected? How long time will things take? What should we allocate in internal efforts? Things like that. And then, of course, also, how can we optimize the journey, essentially? So we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive here together, and we're going to look at durations. We're going to look at time to value and other things for service mapping. And the first thing that I want to show here is the time it takes. I'm speaking now the complete time for a service mapping project versus the scope. And in order to explain this graph, there is a couple of things there that needs to be taken into consideration. First of all, we have the overall amount of mapped applications, basically, or services. And then we obviously have the implementation time in months here. But we also here look at what sort of scope was it? Was it highly complex services, medium complex services, simple complex services, etc.? This is just one of the graphs. We've done this way more detail for all sorts of parameters, but this I think is the most general one. And what is interesting to see here is that, well, most things, they land somewhere in the middle here, or 3 months, or over 1 year. But actually, what is here very fascinating is looking at some of this data. We see that, for example, up here, there was over 500 services mapped on fairly complex services, and that has taken the same amount of time as another project which has less than 100 simple services mapped. So one of the key takeaways that we're going to speak more about today is not just the amount of services that impacts the timeline, but there are other factors as well, and hence why we're here today a little bit. So if we zoom in and double click on this and actually looking at some of the timelines here, so the implementation time by the number of applications mapped, we can see that the key takeaway, first of all, it can be a rather large spread, but the key takeaway is that roughly averaging 6 months, if we took an average of this, then a lot of organizations, if they're serious about service mapping, they manage to map around 250 applications then. However, a majority of companies, they actually don't map more than 200 systems and applications. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, then the amount of systems here, the quantity, does not always correlate to the increased timeline. And again, we're going to speak more about this soon. Now, here, if we have a look at what is the duration, and when I speak duration, I mean from end to end of mapping a system or application, from the first initial discussions with the architecture team to trying to map it, to refining it, to publishing it and approving it, the entire end-to-end flow, basically. Then we see here as well, we've taken in the complexity into consideration, and we plotted that here towards a different type of systems, essentially. And if we interpret this data, we can see some interesting things. First of all, mapping services of high complexity actually takes shorter or equal amount of time compared to a simple one. And in average, most services takes around 1 to 2 weeks to get published and really up to speed, ready to use in production, so end to end. But of course, when you map services, the right thing to do is not just do it sequentially. You don't have to do one, then go to the next, then go to the next, but you can actually do it in parallel. And that's what we see a lot with the client projects. But for me, what really pops out here is that when we really look into the data, a lot of people think that, a very complex application, that's going to take a lot of time. But actually looking at the data, that's not necessarily always true. But, often a very simple application can take equal or more amount of time. And I think that's pretty interesting, Andre. What do you say?
No, 100%. I think, I love the fact that you said about the sequential approach. I've seen that in the past with other customers. And, people have a tendency to just go service by service, but we've seen in the past really good examples by just stacking technologies together. The time to value is increased. And I think when it comes to, the actual effort involved, it's much more, how to put it, laser focused. We focus on this technology, then we move to the next, then we move to the next. And then when we do the actual mapping, then it just works.
Yeah. I know you had some examples, right? Where you had a client a while ago where you guys mapped, it was in the hundreds in a couple of months' time, I think. That just goes to show that it is very much possible to run things in parallel, right? Because you didn't do it one by one, basically.
Yeah.
All right. Super interesting. Now, we're getting a lot of questions here already. Again, gonna take some time later to look into that. But if we can crystallize this then, and looking at some of these success factors, you and me had a pretty good discussion about this, Andre. So, like you have obviously worked with this a lot, so have I. And there's more than these three success factors. But if you would choose here and select a couple, how would you explain these three that we've picked here?
Sure. I think the first one we kind of covered on the previous slide. We've seen great success, especially with pattern-based approach to just group technologies. Like select a bunch of services, find the common denominators, let's say, and then just focus on each technology, and only then at the end start beginning the actual mapping process. For the tag-based approach, what we've seen is a lot of organizations have a tendency to just do it, just randomly tag and then randomly create the maps and so on. But what we've seen is that the tagging strategy, which is in the backstage, should have a higher priority to begin with. I mean, okay, it's fine to do like a POC type of tag-based, but to actually scale the solution, the tagging strategy will be critical. And also, of course, implementing the tagging policies. It's important not to get, for the process to become hectic and to actually have a good methodology behind the full process in order to ensure the correct scaling and proper maintenance overall. And then the third point, which kind of goes hand in hand with what I said, when it comes to governance, and I think this applies to any methodology you may use, governance has a tendency to be overlooked when, it should have like priority one when it comes to importance. Like, as I said, maybe it's okay to have like a POC small scale, but then if you are serious about scaling service mapping, focusing on governance will be one of the key aspects which will define success or not so much success.
Yeah, and actually we're getting a question though from the audience where there is a question on, are there any insights why does a service with high complexity take less or equal amount of time to map than, for example, a simple one? And I think that heavily relates actually to governance, because often it's not actually the mapping of the technology that consumes most of the time. It is the coordination, and it is actually to having like a very repeatable blueprint where you, in a very standardized way, have you know who to talk to, you know how you involve the application teams, you can explain properly the purpose of service mapping. It cannot be ad hoc every time you're gonna create a new service map, but this needs to really stick. And that is for me what really tends to separate like a successful service mapping project from a less successful one. It is largely around the governance part. So I think a lot of people, they have that worry of, oh, our infrastructure is very complex, we have a lot of custom applications, we need to spend a lot of time on creating different patterns and so forth. And yeah, sure, that can be true to a certain extent, but ultimately, if you don't rally your troops when it comes to how you govern this, how you publish these services and have this super streamlined, then yeah, the coordination is going to eat up way more time than what it would take to hack some patterns, let's say. Yeah, so again, this is now just some of the success factors. We have a lot of more insights when it comes to these sort of things, but I think this is the three most critical ones at least. And what is very interesting here, what you said, Andre, is on the first one here, really, that I think people, when they look at their technologies within their organization, they should really, what you said, look at what are the common technologies. So if we are successful in one place, let's say with an F5 load balancer, it means we will be successful in 50 other services that is also using the F5 load balancer. So actually taking that as an approach can be largely helpful. Cool. So we're then gonna start looking into here a little bit. How can we optimize a service mapping project then? What are those sort of factors to take into consideration? And the first thing that we want to have a look at is management involvement and buy-in. Obviously, in any project, this does just not go for service mapping, or not just ServiceNow, but any IT project can benefit from having involvement by management. But we actually wanted to have a look at this also when it comes down to service mapping. And what we could distill from it is kind of expected is that the C-level management is rarely involved, actually. They are involved in some cases, and I would suspect that in heavily regulated industries like finance and others, then, obviously, the C-level from maybe a security perspective or something like that, they really understand the value of we need to have our services mapped, we need to have control of it. But for a lot of other service mapping projects, then it's mostly actually senior management or higher middle management that is in some way connected to the project. What was interesting to see is that there is very few, if any, projects that have no management involvement whatsoever. And I say that's interesting because there do exist some projects, also in ITOM and so forth, where it tends to be more of a grassroots movement, where, for example, it's the architecture team who drives something, and there maybe is not a lot of connection to management. But in service mapping, there definitely is. And this seems to definitely be one of those important factors to take into consideration. Now, we also look here at the planning and team setup. So, when you start a service mapping project, one of the questions that we often receive at Einar and Partners is, how should we plan for it? Who should we involve? Who do we need to have in workshops and so forth and so on? And we looked here at what were the primary teams that were involved during an implementation. And again, we correlated this then to, this is one example of the complexity levels. We have other correlations as well. But here we can see, of course, topping the list would be something like application or service owners, infrastructure teams, etc. But what is interesting here is that if we have a look at the key takeaway, so as I said, we have the usual suspects. I mean, it's difficult to do service mapping without even involving service owners, for example. But security is critical in more than 30% of the services, and architects is getting a more and more prominent role. That might sound ridiculous, but trust me, when I started service mapping, just finding like an architect for a certain service or application was not always possible, but we see more and more this industry trend that architects is really getting into the forefront, also when it comes to service mapping and who to involve. But what is also interesting here is that for very simple services, in more than half of the cases, there isn't even a necessity to involve any service owners. And this actually correlates quite well with what I've experienced in projects. I'm not sure what you say, Andre, but these very simple services, they tend to be able to be done in bulk and maybe by the service mapping team without much direct interface to the service owner.
Yeah, 100%, especially with, 3-layer simple application. Sometimes it works even without actually knowing the blueprint, just knowing the entry point or the first level of tagging, and it's quite straightforward. Yeah, and actually on this slide, we have a really interesting question from Jens. A prerequisite would be to have a mature CMDB with discovery or maybe something else, or do you consider this a part of the project?
That's an interesting one. Well, so in this case here, we're actually only looking at the service mapping part. So that would assume indeed that there is a degree of discovery. Now, of course, if you would do discovery first and then service mapping on top of that, these things will probably look a little bit differently. Now, actually, some shameless promotion here. We do have discovery benchmarks. So if you go to our website and so forth, you can find CMDB and discovery benchmarks if you're curious about that. But indeed, this here assumes that there is a baseline to start with, and now we're ready to do service mapping. We're not looking here at starting from zero and doing both an entire discovery project and service mapping on top, but this is the isolated piece on service mapping. Then, of course, there's a definition question, how mature the CMDB is. I am quite confident that in a lot of these projects, discovery is not perfectly set up, and there will always needs to be done new firewall openings, new things to be discovered, and so forth. And they go a little bit hand in hand, I would say. But I hope that clarifies it at least. Cool. So now here, this is, I think, a little bit juicy information, because a lot of people, when they plan a project, is not just around sort of the how do you involve consultants like Einar and partners or something like that? But often what people want to look at is, well, what is expected from us? Who do we need to send in to workshops and to be partaking into the project? So we actually here as well looked at what is the average internal effort, and I'm saying internal here, per team, and again, correlating that to the complexity level. This is not per service, okay? This is for the full project. And I'm not gonna sit here and read graphs for you in detail today. That's not the purpose. But when we're looking here at the overall average effort of the internal team, if we don't really care about the complexity, but just, any sort of application, high, medium, small, simple, we can see here that, of course, the application or service owners, they top the list. So they have more internal effort. Surprisingly for us, even though the security team is often involved, it tends to not require that much internal effort. And same there, it tends to be the network team. They are important, but once you really get the mid servers working, once you really get things up to speed, you tend to not have to bother them too much. But really, the application teams, the infrastructure teams, and the service owners, they are definitely topping the list there. So for application and service owner, sort of the average median is around 114 hours of internal effort. Of course, here now, again, this is a simplified breakdown of things. What is important to mention is that this also needs to be correlated to the amount of services, the complexity, and there's all sorts of data points which you can add, which would change these graphs. But just to give sort of a general starting point, you can have a look at this. But we also see here the little thing that is saying SD, standard deviation. It deviates quite a lot, as you can see on these. And the reason for that is what I mentioned. It's in the context of how many applications was it during the project? Did we have a management buy-in? All sorts of things, basically. So hence the standard deviation here a little bit being on the higher side of things. But if you're interested in this in a more in-depth way, then yeah, just let us know and we can help you pick out the data which is relevant, like for your setting, let's say. Now, if we look there, Andre, at some success factors to really optimize the project, then how could we look at, if we really want to make it, least amount of internal efforts, make it successful, what would you say is important there?
Right. So in my opinion, service mapping is a process which has a high effort and a high reward, let's say, ratio. In order to actually leverage this and to have like an easier buy-in when it comes to the relationship with the management team and so on, we've seen a lot of success in implementing a proof of concept. Selecting maybe one critical service alongside, I don't know, a couple of non-critical services, or maybe a bunch of 10 services, and just go ahead and create a POC with that. Usually the POCs, in my opinion, should be focus scope, quick timelines, I don't know, a couple of weeks, just to see the power of service mapping to begin with. And then, with a successful POC, you can actually go ahead and do a correct estimation on scaling the solution to the full service landscape. And yeah, I mean, the POC is usually like low risk and still high reward, because you're still doing the things that you were supposed to do if you wanted to scale in the first place. So I think that's one important factor, for me at least, and for the past customers that we've worked with. The POC phase is very important. Then when it comes to service mapping, some organizations have a tendency to feel that it's a plug-and-play solution. I wish that was true, but unfortunately it is not. Service mapping implies a lot of effort in the backstage, as we've seen from application owners, from other stakeholders internally, but also from ServiceNow architects, and so on and so forth. All hands on deck if you want a successful service map project, to be honest. And in the relationship with your organization, I highly suggest to set these expectations correctly. Again, it's not plug and play. It's not so easy to begin with. So I wouldn't oversell and I wouldn't overpromise. I would just be rational and transparent to anyone who has to make the decision, go or no go.
And to comment on that, Andre, because I think this is something which I also see quite a lot, is that some people, they think service mapping is this like silver bullet, where it's like, oh, it can fully automate everything, you barely don't need to do anything and so forth. And then obviously they get disappointed when they face reality a little bit. So then the question is, well, why should we put in all of this effort a little bit? Isn't it supposed to automate more things? But the truth is that, and this is what we see at clients, that let's say if you have your tech stacks and if you're able to actually automate 50 to 60% of that, that's already a huge win. And like mentioned here, it shouldn't be used everywhere either. If you speak about and we have some quite good overviews on when should you invest the effort into doing like the full-blown service mapping of a service. And some examples of that could be, let's say you're in finance, you have some really critical processes or services that falls under regulatory requirements, then yes, for sure, use the most advanced features of service mapping, develop those patterns, do it all. But for some other organizations, it maybe could be more, hey, let's only focus on the production systems and let's try and use as much tag-based as possible for our cloud, for example. But I think it's super important here to be realistic with how service mapping is being introduced to the organization, because in my experience, the selling point shouldn't be, we want to automate everything with the click of a button. No, we want to increase the awareness of how services are being delivered and architectured, and service mapping can be used there strategically. And I think that speaks a little bit on point number 3, Andre, right? So using the right approach for the right context. How would you explain that?
For sure. Service mapping is not one size fits all. And I think understanding the organization is key to go ahead and select the correct method of service mapping, because not all methods are optimal for every customer. And first of all, understanding the service landscape is critical. Understanding the possible time investment from the stakeholders is also key, because just to give you an example, a pattern-based approach will probably take more time than other approaches.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's definitely a process of understanding the need and also the availability of the organization to do this, and to select the best method, which is tailor fit for the current organization that you're working with.
Yeah, exactly. And I think here, again, if you look at the way services are created, then again, not all of them are equal. So if you have very critical services, which are very dynamic, they're maybe existing in the cloud, they might change from one day to another. Well, that obviously deserves a little bit of different attention than comparing to like a small and very static service that rarely changes, for example. So I think here actually knowing a little bit when to use what is very important. And in matter of fact, what we often do there with clients is we have sort of a ranking criteria when it makes sense to use pattern-based, when it makes sense to do manual, when it makes sense to combine them, when it makes sense to do cloud with tag-based and so forth. Now, I want to zoom back a little bit on the POC phase. So one thing there, which I think is very interesting, is also that, by the way, we have a video at Einar and Partners that you can find on YouTube only around how you do like a successful service mapping pilot. But I think, again, one of the things that people there, like you said, Andre, before, make a bit of a mistake in is that one, they either make the POC too big. So, oh, we want to try and prove 10, 15 different applications in the POC because they have this mindset that, well, if we're successful with those, we can automate it anywhere, basically. But in my experience, that is actually the wrong approach a little bit because then they go for the complexity of, oh, if we can automate these things from a complexity level, then we know the product is working. But actually, the POC, in my experience, should be more on, well, what you said, Andre. How do we work with the different teams? How should the governance be? How can we connect application teams? And I think someone wrote here in the chat things like CI/CD pipelines, etc. So more on the overall governance structure, and indeed, of course, also mapping a few services that become super important. But through doing that, you actually get an understanding of the modus operandi of how is it to work with service mapping. And what you said, Andre, I think is super critical of then you also understand what would be the realistic efforts if we would continue to scale this. So I just wanted to mention these points around the POC phase because it tends to be, yeah, quite critical to generate that buy-in, basically. So now, I think, yeah, we're quite good on time, actually. So I'd like to start to wrap up here and see if there is any questions in the audience. So I think here, yeah, we see one pretty interesting question here from Arno. So let me just take next slide here, which is, what would be the end result of a POC? Would this include service operations workspace implementation? I would say absolutely. I think that would be an excellent example because, again, it's not just about patterns and building services, but it's also about the user experience, how people are going to work with this and so forth. So I think that's very important. I see there is another question here as well when we spoke before about the projects and timelines. So would that also include introducing service maps to the teams? And yes, indeed, when we speak about the sort of duration, the timelines and so forth, we really speak about end to end. So that also encapsulates introducing service mapping to appropriate application teams, for example.
Yeah, and as a follow-up to that, what we usually like to do, and we've seen great success, is to actually do a demo with all of the possible methodologies just for them to understand what is the toolbox they have at hand, to see it in action in a demo environment, and yeah, to basically draw some conclusions together. Like, yeah, this would be suitable, this would be not, and so on and so forth. But we've seen great success at actually demoing each of the methodologies described in this webinar.
Yeah, exactly, 100%. Now I'm gonna take a final question here. So the question is basically, if we don't have any out-of-the-box patterns available, and the security or limited access is becoming a challenge, how do we approach pattern development then, basically? And I think here, again, this needs to be contextualized on how critical and important are the services. So if we have a place where security won't allow things, there is limited access, you might not even be able to run patterns or a mid server or something like that, then yeah, you probably need to look into either using lightweight versions of patterns, which are less intrusive, that could sometimes make the security team happy. Or if they really don't allow it at all, then yeah, it can be a tough one. Most likely you will have to look at some alternative solutions, maybe tags, or maybe, let's say, worst case, the more manual approach. There could also be other options. People can use integrations. So if you have CI/CD pipelines, for example, then maybe they can publish data there about deployed servers or deployed containers, etc., without having to use patterns. Could also be an option. But yeah, the security team is definitely always a fun stakeholder to operate with. Now, with 5 minutes left now, then how do we take the next steps from here? So there's a couple of things I want to say. First of all, I want to thank you all. As I said, we had over 200 people sign up for this, and we have so much data. So we were asking ourselves, what should we select? What should we talk about? We're just sort of flying high over it today. We do have a governance survey related to CSDM, actually, where Elina, you are doing some hard work already in understanding a little bit around how do people work with CSDM governance. So it would mean a lot to us if you guys would participate in that survey. It's completely anonymous. We scrub all the data. You've seen now how we work. But yeah, we basically are then able to do these sort of master classes, really getting the pulse of the industry. And I think that's super fun. Then, of course, if you want to meet with us and actually discuss this a little bit more in depth and geek out and have a look at different data or how you can optimize your project, etc., then scan the QR code. That includes a calendar link. Me and Andre will always be happy to jump on board a call. But then, like I said before, we have a lot of content when it comes to service mapping. So that ranges from how to do a successful pilot to how should we know when to use what approach, when should we invest in developing patterns, when should we not invest in developing patterns, etc. And you can find all of that on our YouTube channel, and we frequently also publish these sort of things on LinkedIn actually as well. I don't have a link here to the YouTube channel, so in case you want to know, then just go to YouTube and search for Einar and Partners. But with all of this being said, I think we are with 3 minutes good to go. So I'd like to thank you, Andre, for taking the time here. I would like to thank you, Elina, together with the research unit, for having done all of this fantastic work. And I think it's safe to say that this is just the starting point. We're on a quest here to really optimize, how do organizations work with service mapping, and I'm looking forward to see how we can push it to the next level moving forward. And of course, I also like to thank everyone in the audience who have taken your time 1 hour to sit down with us here today. I hope that we will get to see you in the future upcoming masterclasses and webinars. So you will all get access to the recording. It will come out an email where, again, you can go back to these sort of things. But for now, I'd like to thank you all. I think this was a great session, very informative. So I hope you will have a lovely day out there all where you are. And thank you, Andre and Elina, as well.